All right, welcome back to Wisdone.
Yes, welcome back.
I am Nick.
And I'm Sarah.
As always, it's great to be here with you, Sarah.
It's good to be here, Nick.
We are ready for another deep dive. We're going to do the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey today.
Yep, the 7 Habits.
I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, me too. It's a classic, obviously.
Yeah.
It's been around for a while.
This is one that I think a lot of people have heard of.
Yes.
Maybe they've even read.
Yep.
But I don't know. Do you really apply all 7 habits?
That's the question, right?
That's the question, yeah. I think I'm still working on some of the early ones.
It's a lot.
So let's jump in here.
Yeah.
Covey, he starts off by talking about this shift from what he calls the personality ethic to the character ethic.
Yeah.
So
A really interesting kind of foundational principle right at the beginning of the book that I think is worth spending some time on. He kind of makes the point that, for the last, I don't know, however many years, 50, 60, 70, 100 years even. I guess it depends how far back you want to go. But the self-help literature has really emphasized the personality ethic. This idea that, if you can just learn the right techniques of influence, you can have positive mental attitudes, get the right communication skills, that's going to kind of bring you success in life. And he's like, well, some of that stuff is useful, but it's really focusing on kind of the superficial.
it's like the tactics rather than the principles.
Exactly.
Right.
So he's talking about some of those things are good to have, but if they're not grounded in some really strong principles of character, then it's not going to get you very far. And so he calls that the character ethic. It's this idea that there are these basic underlying principles that govern human effectiveness, and that's really where we need to be start.
Yeah, it kind of compares it to natural laws in the human dimension. There's these things that just are.
Exactly.
And if we don't,
conversely true.
Yeah, and if we don't follow them or understand them, then we're going to run into trouble.
Right. And I think it's really interesting about that is that, he wrote this book in the 80s, but I think today, if anything, that rings even more true. We are so inundated with, techniques and, hacks and tips and, how to kind of game the system and manipulate people. And so I think it's more important than ever to kind of come back to these really basic principles.
Yeah, and so some of these principles that he talks about are things like fairness, integrity, honesty, human dignity, service, those kinds of things. Those are the underlying.
Yeah, things we all sort of have an inherent sense of what's right and wrong, what's fair and unfair. And it's funny because sometimes we can, kind of justify our actions, but deep down we know.
Yeah.
When we're not acting in accordance with those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I hear a lot of people talking about these days is authenticity. Are you being your true self?
Yeah.
And it seems like the more we're trying to kind of hack our way through life and use all these tactics, the less authentic we become.
Right.
Because we're not actually living according to our values.
Yeah.
And so that leads us to the next part of this book that we're going to talk about, which is paradigms.
Yes.
Right? How do we see the world? What are the maps that we're using to navigate? And Covey talks about how we often don't even realize that we're looking through these lenses.
Exactly. We just assume that the way we see the world is the way the world is.
Right.
Right? So we don't even realize that we have these paradigms that are shaping our experience.
Yeah. It's like that old, adage of the, you can show a fish the ocean and they don't even know what water is.
Right.
Right. It's just
Exactly. Or, the classic example in the book, which I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with, is that ambiguous drawing. Where you can either see the young woman or the old woman. And it's once you see both, you can kind of flip back and forth.
It's hard to unsee. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's until you're kind of aware that there's another way of seeing it, you're just no, this is what it is.
Right.
Right. And so I think that's a really powerful example of how, two people with good intentions, with, clear heads, can look at the exact same thing and see it completely differently.
Yeah. And what's even more interesting is when you have that paradigm shift, right?
Yes.
So you've been looking at the world one way, and then all of a sudden something happens. Covey tells this really great story about, I think it's a father on a train, right? And he's getting annoyed at this other guy's kids. And then he finds out, the mom just died.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden his whole perspective shifts.
Yeah.
And that's what he calls a paradigm shift.
Exactly. It's that aha moment, right? Where you see things in a new light.
Right. And he even brings in Thomas Kuhn's work, The Structure of Scientific Revolution.
Yeah.
And how that's like the basis of how science progresses.
Exactly. You have these dominant paradigms, and then something comes along that challenges that, and then you have this kind of revolutionary shift.
Right, and that's where real progress happens.
Yeah.
So if we want to be effective, we need to be aware of our paradigms.
Yes.
And we need to be open to shifting them.
Into shifting them, yeah. And I think that's one of the hardest things, right? Because our paradigms feel so real to us.
Yeah.
We just assume that, our way of seeing the world is the correct way or the only way.
Yeah. And so how do we even begin to shift our paradigms?
Well, I think the first step is just awareness, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, becoming aware that we even have these paradigms.
Yeah.
And that they're not necessarily reality. They're just our interpretation of reality.
Right. And then we can start to question those paradigms.
Yeah.
And we can start to look for evidence that might contradict our beliefs.
Yeah. And I think also just being open to new experiences.
Yeah.
Right? Like putting ourselves in situations where we're going to be challenged. Yeah.
And having to kind of confront our own assumptions about the world.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked about the character ethic, we've talked about paradigms. Now let's get into the first habit, which is be proactive.
Yes.
Now this sounds like it's more than just, taking initiative or being a go-getter.
It is.
Right.
Yeah, it's much deeper than that.
What does it mean to be proactive in the Stephen Covey sense?
So, I mean, in essence, it's about recognizing that we are responsible for our own lives.
Okay.
Right? That we have the power to choose our response to whatever happens to us. So it's not just about, being busy or taking initiative. It's about being responsible for our own choices and our own actions.
Okay. And so he uses Viktor Frankl as an example here, right?
Yes. Yeah. So Viktor Frankl, obviously went through this horrific experience in the concentration camps.
Right.
And he talks about how, even in that situation, he realized that he still had the power to choose his response.
Yeah. Right. That the Nazis could take away everything from him, but they couldn't take away his freedom to choose how he's going to respond to that situation.
Yeah. And I think that's so powerful because it's like, no matter what's happening around us, we always have that choice.
Exactly.
Like, we can't control what other people do, but we can control
our response,
how we respond to it.
Yeah.
So it's really about focusing on our circle of influence, right?
Yeah.
The things that we can actually control.
Yeah. So Covey talks about this idea of the circle of concern and the circle of influence. And so the circle of concern is all the things that we worry about, right? Like all the things that are outside of our control. And then the circle of influence are the things that we can actually do something about.
Okay.
And so his point is that proactive people focus their energy on their circle of influence.
Okay.
And so the more we focus on the things that we can control, the more our circle of influence grows. And the more we focus on the things that we can't control, the more helpless we feel, and our circle of influence shrinks.
Right, yeah. So it's like, if you're worried about the weather, there's not a whole lot you can do about that.
Right.
You can prepare for it, but you can't change it.
Yeah.
But if you're worried about, I don't know, your health, you can eat right, you can exercise, you can get enough sleep, you can do things that are within your control
Exactly.
to improve that. And so I think that's really the essence of being proactive.
Yeah. And it's not to say that we should never be concerned about things outside of our control.
Right.
Right. Like, of course we care about what's happening in the world, but it's about recognizing that we can't control everything and that our energy is best spent focusing on the things that we can.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked about being proactive. Let's move on to habit 2, which is begin with the end in mind.
Okay.
What is that all about?
Well, I think the most sort of straightforward way to think about this is that, anything that's created is created twice.
Okay.
So there's the first creation, which is mental.
Yep.
And then there's the second creation, which is physical.
Oh.
So, if you're building a house, you don't just start laying bricks.
Right.
You have a blueprint.
Yeah.
You have an idea in your mind of what you want the house to look like before you even start building it. And so Covey's point is that we need to do the same thing with our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have a clear vision of what we want to create.
So this is like mission statements, goals, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So he talks about, having a personal mission statement. Like, what is your purpose in life?
Got
What
it.
do you want to stand for? What are your values? And then from there, you can start to set goals,
Okay.
right, that are in alignment with that mission statement.
Okay.
And so it's really about being intentional about the life that you're creating.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us, we kind of just go through life on autopilot.
Yeah.
And we're not really thinking about, like, what's the destination?
Yeah.
Where are we even going?
We're just kind of reacting to whatever comes our way.
Yeah. And so Begin with the end in mind is like, okay, let's actually stop and think about
Exactly.
what do we want our life to look like.
Yeah. And I think it's also about recognizing that we're often living out scripts
Okay.
that we've inherited from other people.
Right.
Like from our parents, from our culture, from society. And so this is about, taking the time to really examine those scripts and decide if they're actually serving us.
Right.
Or if we want to rewrite them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think one of the ways that we can start to do that is by identifying our roles, right?
Yes.
Like, what are the different hats that we wear in life? I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a podcaster, I'm a friend, whatever those roles might be.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we've identified those roles, we can start to think about, okay, what do we want to achieve in each of those roles?
Exactly.
What's the end in mind for each of those areas?
Yeah. And I think it's also helpful to think about, like, what do we want to be remembered for in each of those roles, right? Like, how do we want to show up as a husband, as a father, as a friend?
Yeah. I think that's really powerful. Okay, so we've got the end in mind. Now, how do we actually make that happen?
Well, that's where habit 3 comes in, which is put first things first.
Okay.
So this is really about time management.
Okay.
Right. But it's not just about, being efficient with your time. It's about making sure that you're spending your time on the things that are most important to you.
Okay.
So Covey talks about this time management matrix.
Yeah, the quadrants?
The 4 quadrants, yeah. So he basically divides all of our activities into 4 categories based on urgency and importance.
Okay.
So there are things that are urgent and important. Those are like your crises, your deadlines, things that you have to deal with right away.
Right.
Then there are things that are important but not urgent. And those are the things that Covey says we should be focusing most of our time on.
Okay.
Because those are the things that are going to contribute to our long-term goals.
So that would be things like
planning.
Yeah.
Building relationships.
Yeah.
Taking care of your health.
Yeah, those things that we know we should be doing.
Yeah.
But we don't always get around to because they're not urgent.
Exactly. And then there are things that are urgent but not important.
Right.
Like, interruptions, some emails, things that other people want us to do,
Right.
but that aren't necessarily contributing to our goals. And then finally, there are things that are neither urgent nor important.
Right.
And those are just, time wasters.
Right, like scrolling social media.
Exactly.
So the goal is to spend as much time as possible in that important but not urgent quadrant.
Exactly. So Covey says that quadrant 2 is the heart of effective personal management.
Okay.
Because that's where we're really focusing on the things that are going to make a difference in our lives.
Yeah.
And so he gives a lot of practical tips on how to do that, like scheduling time for your quadrant 2 activities,
Right.
learning to say no to things that aren't important, delegating tasks to other people.
Okay.
So there's a lot of, kind of tactical stuff in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things is that it's not just about managing our time, it's also about managing our energy.
Yes.
Right? Because we all have different times of day when we're more productive.
Exactly.
And so it's about being aware of our own energy levels and scheduling our most important tasks for those times when we're at our best.
Yeah. Yeah. And being willing to, kind of adjust our schedules as needed, right? Like if something comes up that's really important, being able to say, okay, well, maybe I need to reschedule this other thing because this is a higher priority right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's really challenging about being effective.
Yeah.
Is that it's not just about following a set of rules.
Right.
It's about being adaptable and being flexible and being responsive to the situation.
Yeah. And being willing to kind of constantly reevaluate our priorities.
Right.
And make sure that we're still on track.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a place to wrap up our discussion of the first 3 habits.
Yeah.
Right. These are the private victories, as Covey calls them.
Exactly.
The foundation of effectiveness. And we're going to be diving into the public victories in our next episode.
Yeah, which are all about building strong, effective relationships.
Yeah, that's right. So for now, as you go out into the world, think about these 3 habits.
Yes.
Be proactive. Begin with the end in mind. Put first things first.
Yeah. And as you're going through your day, just notice where your energy is going.
Yeah.
Is it going towards those things that are truly important to you? Or is it getting sucked away by things that are just urgent but not really moving you forward?
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, Nick.
Sarah, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, always good to be here.
And we'll see you next time
See you then.
for the next 3 habits.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.